Hi, everyone, and welcome to Soundscape and Mindful Meditation, where we explore the transformative power of meditation, sound healing, mindfulness, and spirituality. My name is Amandine, your guide on this journey toward inner balance and harmony. In this podcast, we delve into practices that nourish the soul, elevate the spirit, and cultivate a deeper connection with oneself. Each episode is crafted to bring you moments of tranquility or introspection, whether you're seeking relaxation, stress relief, or a pathway to self-discovery, you're in the right place. Joining us in the studio today is Reverend Kelly Billings, a beacon of authenticity and a former Christian reverend whose story is a testament to the power of bravery, faith, and living one's truth. His journey from the pulpit to the heart of self-discovery has inspired many, and today he's here to share his light with us. In this episode, we dive into the essence of what it means to be true to oneself, the struggle and the beauty of stepping off the beaten path, and how solitude can sometimes be the loudest goal to inner peace. So sit back, take a deep breath, sip on your tea, and let the noise of the world fade away and tune into the frequency of your authentic self. Let's start this journey with Reverend Kelly. All right, so thank you so much, Reverend. How should I call you?
Just Kelly.
Kelly?
Yeah.
Kelly Billings?
Billings, yep.
For being here today on my podcast, Soundscape and Mindful Meditation. It is a pleasure to have this conversation today. We decided that we're going to have a theme of authenticity, how to be our authentic self. So I'm very eager to explore what that means and have your vision and your optic on the matters. I think you have a beautiful story. And how to get started, how about you introduce briefly you know, what you do, and so give us a background.
Well, first I'd say it's an honor to be invited. So thank you much for that. And I really just appreciate the gift that you're putting out in the world and the safe space for people to share and listen and maybe contemplate and maybe help them move into their authentic selves. Yeah, so about me, I currently work as a spiritual counselor with hospice patients. That's my full-time job. Prior to that, I was in the Middle East for several years working with refugees. And then prior to that, I was actually a Christian pastor in the Methodist Church. And it was my work in the Middle East that really brought a significant amount of change into my life.
Yeah, we're going to get a little bit more on that, actually. And I appreciate that experience that you had. I feel like it's the conversation we're going to have, we can listen to at any point in the history of human life, but your aha moment, I feel, is very timely to what is going on today. So I'll be interested to even more to hear that story. So here's my question in regards to that realization, that change that happened in your life. Could you share about that turning point when you realized that your spiritual practice and who you were was no longer aligned with your soul, I would say? And and what change happened when you realized that there was a dissonance within?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I had been a United Methodist minister. You know, like you, I have a bit of an accent. So mine's from southeastern United States. I grew up in North Carolina and was a United Methodist minister. And even though within United Methodism, it's a more liberal denomination and understanding of Christianity, being in the Southeast and in the rural Southeast, there's still a lot of conservative politics and theology that pervades a lot of everything. It's just the culture. And so I took a year off to go to Bethlehem, where we think Jesus was born. And I go, and I thought I was going to Israel. And then I realized there was yet one more border to cross. I flew into Israel, but there was one more border to cross yet still. And I found myself in the Palestinian territories. And so I quickly observed and discovered that much that I had heard about the Israeli-Palestinian situation was the opposite of what I was seeing and experiencing. And as I tried to reconcile and understand what was going on and why I didn't know what was going on and why I had a different perception of rather than what I was seeing, I then started to ask, well, who told me these things? And so I was working with an organization, a humanitarian aid organization, part of Bethlehem Bible College. And every evening I would go up to the top of the roof and I would pray. And there was one refugee camp across the street in front of me, and then one a few blocks behind me. And my first thought was, as I started to pray, I was like, well, what have I done with my uninformed position on this situation? How have I contributed to it? How have I? And then the second thing, I just collapsed in a puddle of tears one night, just to be really honest. It was like, well, God, the same people that told me about this situation, they also told me about you. They're wrong about this, or they're wrong about you too. Do you even exist? Which was a very significant question for me to ask, having grown up in a Christian environment, but not always being super Christian. But then
Christian enough to become a reverend.
Yes. And so that was an odd story in itself. That whole kind of drawing into that is something that I wouldn't have chosen for myself, but yet I felt like something outside of me was drawing me. So I thought, well, if it's not me, then what is it? Well, then maybe it's God. And so that was that. So I had found myself here in Bethlehem, deciding that a lot of what the church had taught me and what I'd learned in seminary wasn't accurate. Which caused me to say, well, I didn't want to return to Christian pastoral ministry. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And that caused me to question, most of my worldviews, my politics, just the way I saw everything. And, well, if this was wrong, what else is wrong? If what I'd heard was untrue, what else is untrue? And it was really a very significant spiritual deconstruction.
A deep one.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, because you saw something and you didn't just question that cultural, geopolitical issue. You everything shattered within, for the worse in the moment, I would imagine, and then for the better.
Ironically, it's both. As most spiritual, as most things are. There's good and bad in both, usually, and sometimes it takes us really a long time to see the good. And so I say it's both one of the most painful things that's ever happened, but also by far the best thing that ever happened.
For all the things that unfolded, yeah. So reflecting on your evolution, what step did you take to embrace and live out your authentic self, the one that would be aligned with, that you didn't know at that moment of realization, I assume? What were the steps that led you to that and the change that followed that realization?
Well, it was really a loss of identity along with everything else. And so there was a lot of several years of trying to figure out who I was, what did I want to do vocationally, professionally now, and what did I think spiritually. And initially my thoughts, and then my thoughts were on, who am I? And so it was really a lot of unlearning and a lot of soul searching. It's often called in the Christian church the dark night of the soul. And in a lot of different religions and spiritualities, there's this history of wandering in the wilderness or being in the desert. And it was like that for a few years. And it was unlearning and letting go of identities I had. And a lot of those had been placed upon me, just culturally speaking. We just sort of, at a very early age, within just, a year or so of our life, we learn, oh yeah, if I do this, I'm rewarded with affection, food, love, whatever. And if I don't, then I don't receive those things. And so we all very unconsciously become who those around us want us to be. Now, they don't really know they're doing it.
No,
usually, usually they don't know they're doing it. It's what they learned. And so it's really often hard to break those generational cultural expectations and cycles. And it usually takes a big event like this for most people to give us the courage and the permission to do so, and finding ourselves so broken that we really don't worry about offending anybody else. I shouldn't say offending, disappointing anybody else, and not meeting those expectations of those around us.
Yeah. For me, it was the other way around. I was in an anti-religion and a theist household. And when I was told, I don't remember it. And one of the first time you were being asked, what do you want to do when you're a grown up? I want to be a nun. We've never said even the word God in your house. What do you mean?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for me, it was I don't know. Yeah, I even asked my mom to go to church when I was 7 or something like this. And she was like, what? Well, I guess if you really want to, I'll call some friends when they go. But yeah, no, I was appreciated that they led me. But yeah, it was funny. Like I had to push, to find my way to it. I have well, one thing that I found very interesting in your process is you said your first step was to unlearn.
Mm-hmm.
And could you share a little bit? Because, the first thing when I hear that is that there must be a part, that you don't have a goal yet. And you're you have to have a leap of faith with of you with yourself, or, to be able to go through that. I don't know where I am. I don't even know where the light is, which tunnel I'm supposed to. So could you help us through that, a little, like for people maybe who are going through that same phase and are afraid to let go because they don't know what's ahead?
Yeah, I think in my case, the trauma of what I saw was inaccurate, was so significant, it was easy to let go of a lot of other stuff. And I probably did so in a very rebellious and even somewhat unhealthy way. Like, I don't know what I think about the divine or source or spirit or God or whatever. I don't know what I think about Jesus. And the things I'm really grateful for is that just at the right time, it seemed like Spirit would pop these mentors and these guides up. And it was just going with my intuition that felt right. There still was a lot of crying out at night, and I don't know what to do, how to do this, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do, I'm asking for guidance.
You were still trying to...
I was, and it had been a very significant, so I had became a Christian minister when I was probably 35, so it wasn't even like an early start for me. I had changed careers and had this drawing into it. As I mentioned, something that felt like is outside of myself was drawing it, and then also empowering me. I was born premature, several birth defects, and one of them was a speech impediment. And so there was literally nothing any scarier than standing up in front of speaking to people. And I had surgery in my mouth when I was about 6 years old, and then years of speech therapy and stuttered, and a lot of ridicule as a child and as a teen about the way I spoke. And then combine that with my accent. There was a lot of ridicule. And so the thoughts of standing up and speaking in front of people, just being able to do it and survive was like big, but to do it and like be effective and be part of people's spiritual formation and the growth was like almost impossible for me to conceive. Mm-hmm. But yet it occurred. And so it was really confusing because I was like, well, I really feel like I've done these things and have been doing this role that was beyond my physical capabilities to do. I had always felt that. It wasn't just me. Mm. And even from an early age, before I was really, really Christian, there was this sense of this awareness of God that I came through sort of like you described, just always being connected. Mm-hmm. And then even when I was a Christian, I really took a lot of the metaphysical passages of what Jesus spoke about the Spirit and us being connected and we're all being one. Those were very literal to me, but not because the Bible said it, but because I felt it. And then that described it. And so it was a very confusing time because some things that had been just so significant and so powerful and so transforming to me, mm-hmm. and then finding sort of my stride finally in this career and then coming to understand, well, maybe this theology wasn't accurate. It was really painful. And so I was like, well, God, do you exist? And if you don't, well, how did all these other things happen in the past that I think were more than just me? And so I continued to wrestle for several years, like, well, what do I believe? Mm-hmm. And it was a slow unpacking. I quickly decided I really didn't want to return to, Christian ministry, but I wasn't sure what I thought, what I wanted to do. So I ended up in England. Now, I was, after 6 months in Bethlehem, I came back to the States for a few months, really did not like it. And was like, okay, I ended up doing another master's degree in England. And so I was like, somehow professionally, I've got to do something that makes sense on a resume. So when people look at it, they won't, that I'm totally crazy.
Well, yeah, because if you present yourself as a Christian reverend who he's not sure yet anymore if God exists, it's not really.
Yes, exactly. So I really found a niche there in humanitarian aid and I ended up going back to Palestine a few years later for like 6 years, but also working in Jordan and an island off the coast of Turkey called Lesbos during the ISIS and Syrian crisis.
Wow. And
so it was a path that. And again, it was like unlearning and like having to my family's like, well, we really don't want you to go into Jordan on the Syrian border. And I'm like, it'll be okay. Yeah, yes. And so,
Inshallah.
Yeah. And so it was a wonderful experience. It was during the rise of ISIS and being there, yes, it was my Muslim neighbors that came to me and said, if ISIS comes, we'll hide you. Mm. And it was learning about different passages and different books in the Quran that I'd never heard of, and seeing people who I thought, or maybe even my family thought, were going to behead me, just love me and care for me. And so that just brought a whole lot more confusion, but yet it was very nurturing at the same time. And so there was probably, 6 or 7 years of that wandering, trying to figure out, who I was and what I was doing, that slow kind of eventually release of Christianity. And it wasn't so slow. I mean, some ways I really threw out the baby with the bathwater, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But it was just it was like really being open to what was presented to me. And as I said, the universe was just really just putting people and mentors in my path that were really, really transformational.
And were those mentors, so you mentioned that you read a little bit about the Quran. Were they outside of any faith, or were they, from different faiths? So I know that what I'm asking is basically, in my search, I quickly came to realize early on that I believed and I wanted to go to church, but I also very quickly came out of church being like, by the time I was 11 or 12, I knew that Catholicism wasn't me and I needed to pursue differently. And through other faith, I learned, and I'm wondering, this basically your mentors, the connection with different faith helped you realign.
They did, but most of them were of what, we would call New Thought or New Age spirituality. They weren't from traditional spiritual backgrounds. That's just who happened to be presented to me.
Nice. Interesting. So, well, you mentioned that you had a lot of conflicts during your transition. How did you manage to, once you had shed, and you were, I guess, through action, maybe you were finding yourself more than through meditation. I'm curious how the reconnection with happened.
I think that's a good question. Some of these things are really hard to describe.
Sorry, I'm a nerd when it comes to that.
No, it's great questions, because what I find is the questions that you ask me is really, it's I'm getting to relive these experiences again, which is really grateful, because it really produces gratitude in me for them. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, thank you for sharing that. That means a lot. I appreciate that comment. So my question is about, once you had shed that your anger and your old beliefs, and you basically had tabula rasa, you were an empty plate and you were starting to rebuild yourself. What were the elements that helped you reconnect and create your core identity? So there is obviously a lot of action. Is there like a meditation? I'm curious about that process.
Yeah. So I think even when I was still Christian, my prayer was like meditation. It was 20 minutes or so of silence in the morning, and then journaling, which was very significant. So I maintained that practice, and just, into meditation without any particular spiritual readings or texts to prompt me. It was a bit of a slow release. Even though while there was a lot of anger inside of me, there was still a slow release of somewhat of Christianity and the spiritual practices of it. Even though I was confused and angry, I still sort of had one foot in, because I still wasn't sure where the next foot needed to go. And I think in some ways I probably wasn't being totally authentic with myself for those around me as to where I was in my spiritual journey at that point. And I'm not even sure I knew how to describe it. It's sort of like being, not to diminish the plight of anyone who's unhoused, but it's almost like being homeless for a bit. Because I wasn't sure. I was like, I'm not sure I'm ready to leave this, but I know this doesn't fit anymore.
I have an expression in French. We say you have the ass between two chairs.
So there was a bit of that, and that's exactly how it felt. It's like, if it gets too wide, I'm gonna fall through. And it was interesting. During that time, I was back in Palestine, I was in Jordan, I was in Lesbos, and still sort of wavering a bit through it all, just kind of trying to navigate. At that point, I did not believe that God needed. And it's interesting, we're doing this on Easter, what we call Easter Sunday, but yes. I didn't believe that God needed to kill God's son before God would love or accept me. That was where my big sort of hang-up came with Christian theology. And the other thing, and I maybe failed to mention this, is like a lot of the trauma I'd had was like in teaching that theology and the sacrificial atonement theory, just I had trauma around teaching that, because I really believed it was right. And then I came to a point like, I don't think that's right. And then I came to a point, it's like, well, I should never teach anything ever again, because I was really convinced that was right, but I was wrong.
Mm.
And that was it was really hard.
I would imagine.
And am I answering your question? Because
It's
I'm sorry.
no,
It's
and I
like this-
appreciate that how you're getting into something, but it's still super interesting. So that's why I'm not stopping you, and I'm like, I'm just listening. I appreciate the
And I apologize to
what's
our
happening.
listeners if I'm rambling too much and going off on too many tangents.
One thing that I would love to hear, and I have a feeling a listener will want as they listen, is if you could share, like moments, during your years of work. You mentioned a couple of things with like, your neighbors saying that they would help you. You must have had a lot of intense, beautiful human moments that I would imagine also helped you like connect through, through your rebuilding process. I'm sure a lot of those interactions were really important in solidifying the rebuild that was happening. I'm sorry if my question is...
Yeah, no, it's great. Maybe somewhat, and maybe on a very unconscious level, but I was really private about what I was experiencing. And so a lot of people just assumed I was Christian because I was American and I was a white guy and I was showing up. And so often it was just easier, particularly when you're in high trauma situations, just easier to try to navigate the urgent needs. And and my faith at that time, compared to what others were going through, was not an urgent need compared to what they were experiencing. So there wasn't a lot of conversations about that other than just being highly impacted by people's love, no matter what their faith was or no faith. And, that was really, really significant.
Amen.
And just feeling that love and just journeying with them. A lot of what I did at that time was just have a compassionate listening posture. And even though I might have been giving out food or clothing or doing some other stuff, it was really giving value to their experience by giving a listening presence and allowing them to share what they had gone through and give value to their voice.
Well, thank you for that answer. And for your work. Must have been very needed.
I think it was as much needed for me as it was for them, if that makes sense.
Usually the one who gives is the one who receives just as much.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. How many times I'm like, oh, shoot, I have to heal this person. Am I up to the task? And at the end of the session, I'm like, well, here is my slap back to myself. We both get healed. Yeah, it's the beauty of giving. My next question. So you came back and you started to find your voice. How do you maintain that sense of belonging or as you were, coming in alignment with yourself, how did you maintain that sense of belonging and navigated the feelings of isolation in forging your new spiritual and individual path?
It was lonely and at times isolating. And I think there's probably some benefit in that too, even though it's quite uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It does cause us, or can cause us, to reach out to source or the divine or whatever term we want to use. And also it causes us to strive to try to find those of like minds, of like hearts, of like thoughts, a place where we can feel comfortable and safe. And those can be really hard to find at times. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that like shows like yours do so well, is because it is a safe place for people to come. And even if they're not interacting directly with us, they are energetically. Mm-hmm. And creating a safe place where maybe just somebody who's like, well, I'm not the only one who thinks like that. And it's like, aha, that really feels good just to know somebody else is wrestling what I've wrestled with. And so it can be quite lonely. And I think, most of us, still kind of suffering from the effects of the pandemic. I think a lot of us suffered from isolation and loss of community and socialization.
Yeah.
And, but I think it's also it's caused us to realize the importance of community, but also maybe the importance of proper community.
I like the distinction.
Yeah, because I think we're often like, we're polite and we're put in social circles and, these things. And it's, so sometimes for a lot of us, especially depending on the household you grew up in, it can be hard to say no when somebody invites you to something. If you don't, I don't want to disappoint them. And they're being very kind by inviting me. And I'm really tired of sitting here at home alone and, eating my own food. And it's like, somebody's inviting me and you go, and you're like, it's nice to be out of the house and nice to eat somebody's cooking, but that's not really a place where I feel like is my place.
I hear that.
And so it's kind of like, how do we have the courage to like thank somebody, but yet like keep looking for the proper place, And I think that's one of the things about the internet is like we can, and it's not the same as in-person community. I think that's another thing that's coming out of COVID. It's like, we can have 1 million friends on Facebook, but how many friends do you really have?
Yeah.
I mean, how many could we confide in?
Finding a place is also where you can have actual conversation. Because when I hear people saying like, I'm on social media all the time and communicating, it's like, are you communicating or are you putting like thumbs up smileys, and 3-word sentences? That doesn't work for me.
No, it's not. And, we're all primarily energetic. We're all vibrational energetic. So a lot of what we feel and we resonate with is the energy of other people in groups. So we feel their vibration, we feel their energy, and that nourishes us, and we nourish others. And so it's like that's lacking too if we're only doing it, with our thumbs and our fingers.
Yeah.
Rather
superficial. I mean, you can have a deeper conversation, when you go in forums and things like that, but it's obviously not at the front,
It's still, in my opinion, it's still not the same.
True.
And I think it's still, and I think we live in a culture to where a lot of followers and getting a lot of likes and a lot of subscribers really feed our ego and feed our status and sort of help shape, again, who we are. But it's like, is it really feeding us? Not our ego, but is it feeding our soul? And is it nurturing us?
True. So how did you manage to find a community? How did you manage to, find the strength to say no to that kind of community and yes to that kind of community that is more in line with me?
I think part of it was just, it's like, being alone, but not being alone and not being, it's not like I was just usually didn't engage in a lot of distractive activity. It was like trying to use that time to cultivate and understand who I am and, what brings me joy. And it seems that for most of us, we really have to try a lot of things and figure out what we don't like before we find what we do like. And it's just a sort of a random series of events that I ended up with this group, Unity Spiritual Community, Central Oregon. And I found community there. I moved to this area where we're at now a week before COVID hit. Just
wonderful time to find a community.
Yeah, which was really, which really pissed me off because I was coming out of the Middle East to establish community and sink some roots, and then I'm here and there's nobody.
I hear you. I moved 2 or 3 months before the pandemic here, so we're on the same boat. Like, okay, well, we have a new home, so I guess we're just gonna build stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we all kind of did that. What can I do?
Yeah. The only thing that was open was Lowe's and Home Depot. So I guess I'm going to buy wood and build stuff.
Exactly. I think everybody did that because wood prices skyrocketed then. And so everybody was like, and I think it was probably despite all the challenges of the pandemic and the disease and those who suffered and those who died, there were some benefits that come out of it. For a lot of us, it was a reset. A lot of it, we went through what what many social scientists have called the Great Resignation. But I really like better to call it the Great Reevaluation because people reevaluated their lives.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people discovered it's like, because somebody had to stay home and help the kids do online school. They're like, you know what? I really like this being at home more. And, if we buy less, we don't have to have as much income. And so I think a lot of people discovered that. It was like, oh yeah, and this sort of this rabid consumerism of us satisfying our desires by purchasing things, which works for a little bit, but then you need to buy something else, and and I really know, trust me.
Oh yeah.
and I think a lot of us discovered, well, that's really not sufficient.
No, it's superficial. Yeah, it's a short-term fix. But on the scale of life, it's not only a superficial way, it's just as useful as eating your pain away. And on top of it, we're wasting resources for the things that are only going to make us slightly happy for like a night or a weekend. You're like, no, we need to find something deeper that doesn't destroy resources of the planet or that puts us in line with us, with our world. I don't know. Yeah.
And I think you used a great word there, alignment. It's like if we can eliminate some distraction, and a lot of it is culturally put to us, we really have to be countercultural to eliminate a lot of distraction. We can start to find out what we don't like, what really feeds our soul, what I mean when I say that is like bring us joy. If we find it life-giving, it's not depleting. When we can do that, we start to become more in alignment with ourselves. And, like me, it often takes for a lot of us a big sort of cosmic, big event or crisis to give us the courage and the resources to say, no, that's not right for me. That's not. And then I think the on the other hand of that, I think when we leave that, and we usually comes with a lot of anger and some courage. But then if we can look back and start to, as others before me have said, and I think it's Richard Rohr who's written about this, being able to transcend and include, to look back and see what has served us and what has done us well, and to be able to still include that and not just sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
I agree. I always think and always tell my students, gratefulness is the ultimate energy from which everything unfolds. And so when you're letting go of something, I don't know if you remember her, a Japanese woman, very famous a few years ago with the world of minimalism. It was like, if it doesn't spark joy, you let go, but you thank it for, the time it served you. And I always kind of try to bring that in my sessions, like, do not just release that emotion. It was part of you. It made you feel. You're on this planet to feel. So thank it for the work it did. Maybe it helped you in a specific way you don't know at that time. And release it with love and kindness. Send it to do a better work. Now it no longer fulfills you. And I feel like when you do that process with love, you bring that unconditional love of like, even if, you're being a pain right now within, I still love you and I want you to do good somewhere else.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think that's amazing.
So we were a little bit talking about the unity community that you found here. So I have a question a little bit tied to that. Considering the rise of spiritual but not religious demographic, which I feel is a little, that community is a little more spiritual than religious. What insights can you offer from your experience about where spirituality is headed and its impact on personal authenticity?
I think the rise of podcasts like yours and others and different social media groups and places where people can join in and share and try to discover who they are. I think they are creating a trajectory where we're just not going along with the status quo. We're just not following just what's been presented. You spoke of a Roman Catholic background. I grew up in a Protestant background. But I wonder if there's still things that, like, in those experiences we had that we can still pull forward and still maybe benefit from, or at least have gratitude for, like you were saying, but maybe not have it lorded over us, maybe not having it used to fear or, in a method to use fear to control people. And I think, unfortunately, that's what happened to a lot of religion over the years. One of the worst things I think that ever happened to Christianity was it became a state religion of Rome, or somewhere around 300 AD. Before that, those followers of Jesus were they were often very metaphysical. And, we talk about the desert mother and fathers who lived out around the Dead Sea and who had this metaphysical understanding of Jesus and his teachings. And interestingly enough, the Franciscans in the Catholic Church, they've not believed in the sacrificial atonement theory. They've not believed that Jesus had to die for one's sins before you go to heaven, which is interesting because they've remained very within the Catholic umbrella, for 1,500 years or so now, maybe a little less. And, Francis, he started, he had a very significant conversion experience, so to speak, also. He was wealthy, came from a very wealthy family, and then decided, no, this isn't, and I'm not being anti-wealth, but it's like that just wasn't his path. And as we all know, Francis blessed animals, and he was into nature, and that's where he connected with the divine. And, you and I living here in the Northwest United States is like we live in a beautiful place.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of my favorite sayings is, and I can't remember who said this, it wasn't me originally, but I'd rather be in the mountains thinking about God than I would be in a church thinking about the mountains.
My kind of person.
You guys can't see the expression she just made, but it was really amazing.
It makes so much sense how, if from an early age, as soon as I started to discover, new like neo-Celticism and new modern ways of understanding our world, there are things that just clicked for me. I started to cry. I had a revelation as I was reading, I remember being 13 or 14 and reading, I was like, oh my God, that's a way we can spiritually be, revelations. I grew up in a world where 70% of the people are atheist and the other ones are Catholic. There's not a lot of room in between, no interest.
Yeah.
Which is great, because it allows you to explore, but you don't have a lot of pointers. And especially at the time, we didn't have internet the way we have it today. So yeah, you didn't know that there would be all of those variations. And yeah, there was that you can feel it in your heart. And it was a lot of connecting with the sacred through nature.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was like, yeah, that makes more sense to me to celebrate the spring and the arrival of that energy of life and, and roll with the world that we're a part of rather than creating, especially in Europe, those massive, like 2 feet or 3 feet large walls to separate yourself from nature. I mean, I understand that 1,000 years ago was useful, not to be cold outside, but at the same time, you're completely separated from anything that the sacred created.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that sentence in that way, that for the early on, I was like, how can we connect with the creation when we are enclosed in this space?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's really, I think about people who live in really densely populated urban environments. And they have to work really, really hard to get to a green space. Maybe take 2 or 3 buses or take the train, or some, so it's an all-day ordeal just to get into nature.
Yeah.
And, I just kind of have this little sadness as I think about having to put forth that effort and that energy just to get into nature.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why I really enjoyed Oregon, being so close to, even when you're in Portland, you're 5 minutes away from like a decent park. And yeah, it's so important to be able to connect. All right, next question. In what ways have you integrated the positive aspects of your former Christian background into your current practice of spirituality and authenticity? It leans a little bit on some of the things that we just shared, but...
Yeah, I'll try to be a little more specific. It's interesting. I've come back around to having this appreciation for Jesus, and with this understanding, of him being a model for us rather than a transaction. That God didn't need a transaction to love us. That God just loves us because we were created and we're part of God. There's not a separation that has to be overcome. And it's really interesting. There's starting to come some evidence. I don't know if evidence, but there's some writings that's coming from the East of that Jesus, there's this 18-year period where we know nothing about Jesus. From age 12 to 30, we don't know anything. And as one of my friends like to say, well, we just kind of yada, yada, yada over it.
Yeah.
But there's some people believe that there is evidence that he actually went down to Egypt, which is interesting. That's where his family went when they had to flee because he was going to be killed by the ruler at that time as being perceived as a threat to his reign, and then on to India and Tibet, that Jesus was there learning Eastern mysticism. And then he comes back to Israel, and he's in this culture with this very external deity, and Jesus is saying things like, well, the kingdom of God is at hand, or the kingdom of God is within you. And he starts to teach this connection with the divine and saying very metaphysical things like, and he used the word Father for God. I mean, that was just culturally accepted at that time. That's the word that he used. And he would say things like, well, I and the Father are one, and if you are in me and I am the Father, we're all one. Very metaphysical.
Yeah. I like that.
And so I'm looking back on these now, and I'm like, oh yeah, So, and we talk about the Christ consciousness, and the Christ is a Greek word that just means anointed, with of the Spirit. In Hebrew it's Messiah.
Yeah.
Hebrew Messiah, Greek is Christ, and it's like the anointed one. And as Jesus said, he told his followers, like the night before he crossed over, he's like, you'll do greater things than even I have done. So is that something we focus on? Is it often just kind of skipped over because we really don't understand it, and it's often skipped over? It's just one of those.
And I wonder sometimes also if it's skipped over because we're in a culture of institutionalized religion, and well, especially in Catholicism, I will speak for what I know. We have a big guy. I mean, I don't want to offend anyone, but we joke sometimes in friends that we call it the number one mafia in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a very big structure, and you wonder, like, usually the devil always, slips in through power and money.
Yeah.
And there you have both. And you wonder, like, how many of the decision of the way you're sharing, about that religion is tied to helping people get enlightened, and how much is it tied to controlling them? I mean, I have a list of stories, I could tell you about how my great-grandfather was shot, by the government, help with the church, who preferred to keep control, with the current government instead of helping its followers.
Yeah.
And we know, there has been so sometimes you wonder if it's, we just genuinely did not understand. We put it under the rug, and we kept it, so we don't shake too much the tree. Or is it something, a little bit designed of like, well, we don't want you guys to get too enlightened, so keep fearing, or maybe there's a little bit of both, or maybe, yeah, it was.
I would say both.
Yeah.
I would say, there's probably, it appears that there has been intentional control and power at times. I mean, if you look particularly way back, land acquisition, control, power. The thing that I found, even when I was in Christianity, both within Roman Catholicism and in Protestant Christianity, is that there really are a lot of good people, even those who go into, professional ministry, really wanting to do good and really believing there's something to this, and this can make a positive change and difference in people's lives. Yeah. And I think a lot of them, they're just teaching what they've been taught, and they really don't know any better. Yeah. And so for that group, it's like, can we hold somebody at fault for what they don't know? Maybe, maybe not. But I think, if we push against anything too hard, then we get back in using that same energy. Yeah. It's like I might have a different position, but it's that same negative energy of pushing against something or being anti something. And I like, when we can be for something. Well, what are we for? And what's the positivity of this? But I do try to, I had to work really hard to get back to a point of like not being anti-Christian and not being anti-Jesus and not being anti-church. And it's really been my work with hospice patients and their journey as they prepare to cross over. And I've had some wonderful Christians, who really like, oh yeah, Jesus said, love your neighbors yourself. Yeah. He said, do unto others as you would have them do to you. He said, love God with all you got. And wonderful people who would live that out. Sometimes I meet some of those who don't quite, don't quite understand that part, too. I'm honest.
Well, you have to be challenged, a little bit once in a while.
But it's been an interesting journey, even as I'm still sort of on my journey, And originally, that first time to Bethlehem was 2007. So so it's been a minute, yeah. And so it's still this understanding of like, what do I think about the Christ, and are we separate or different? And I don't think so. I think God is this, or the divine is this being that's both without and within, that's somehow separate but also part of us too. And I think we're all fractals or parts of that divine, and we come to this planet to express that, to experience that, to learn, to grow, to raise our own human consciousness, individual consciousness, which then will raise the human consciousness on the planet.
I agree with that. That's beautifully said. Thank you. And thank you for sharing that part about, yes, I think that you're completely right. There is a lot of people. You don't join a ministry when you don't care about others. You join a ministry, at least in the beginning, because you're feeling a call. You're wanting to help others. You've grasp something that maybe they're yet to grasp, so you want to share that edge so that they can catch up. So it's important, I think, that when we look at things, we understand that nothing is black or white and everything is a shade of gray. And then it's up to every single one of us to look within and, am I aligned with myself and with what I'm teaching? Is there a shadow somewhere that I should, allow myself to look at, and not just let a mound of dirt underneath the rug because we've put so much.
Right. Now, all that being said, I do think there are probably some people who go into professional ministry for the power and the authority and the recognition.
Well, I mean, we're all humans, so we get a little bit of everything to make a world, right? So that's our job, I guess, to steer them back into the world of light.
Yeah.
Do you have anything that you would like to close with in relation to being authentic or your current work and how, all that we've talked about, comes together today in what you do, or if you have tips also for the people that are going through that as well?
One of the things that immediately pops to my mind as you asked that was, in my work with hospice patients, a lot of people won't look back and I don't know if they don't have the courage or they just don't want to see. They don't look back at regrets they've had. I mean, some may say regrets, but they're often like, if it's a big regret about their lives, they don't often even want to admit that to themselves. But those who have the courage to say, oh, the time on this planet's wrapping up, what I had wished I'd done different. There's often laments or regrets about how I treated this child or maybe my spouse or something else, and I used to hear sort of, I don't know where, just culturally, it's like people would say, oh, I wish I didn't work so much. But that's not what I've heard people say. What I've heard people say is I live my life for everybody else and I wish I lived it for myself. And, our time on this planet is short. And I believe we do have multiple lives, which to me that takes a lot of pressure of trying to get everything right this time and gives me the ability to forgive myself. But to hear people say, well, I've lived for other people, or I always did what everybody else wanted, is very powerful. As you may only have a few months left in your body to come to that realization, or maybe vocalize it for the first time, even if you've known it. So I would encourage people, not to always strive to meet everyone's expectations, but in a healthy way, meet your own. If there's things that need to be shed and let go, I encourage you to have the courage to do that, and to love yourself. Man, just love yourself in a healthy way.
Yeah.
There's a favorite saying I have. It's written by an African-American philosopher and theologian. His name is Howard Thurman. And what he said was, don't ask what this world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go and do it, because that's what the world needs. People who've come alive.
I love that quote. It's beautiful. And yeah, I agree with that. Even if you don't feel like this resonate with you, and you're like, yeah, everybody else should love themselves but me. No, you're part of us. You're a human. You're understanding this message. You're a human in your heart as much light and as anybody else. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank
today.
you. This has been a joy.
Yeah. If anyone is interested in keeping the conversation alive or has something to share, know that you can always reach out. There is the email in the description below, and you can also reach out to me through DMs on Instagram, and I'll be happy to exchange with you. If you want to pass a message to Kelly, you can also email me and I will forward the email to him. I will not just put his email on the podcast. I will not do that. But know that the gate is open and you're welcome to share anything that you feel you need to share.
Yeah. And everybody's journey is individual. What we've shared today may not resonate with you.
And that's okay.
Yeah. And that's really okay.
We still had a good time.
We did.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
And that's it for today, you guys. As we bring an end to this enriching conversation, I'd like to extend a heartful Thank you to Reverend Kelly Billings for sharing his inspiring journey with us, and to you, our listeners, for joining us on this voyage of self-discovery. If Kelly's story resonated with you and you're eager for more soulful stories and transformative insights, I highly recommend that you click the subscribe or follow button. By doing so, you will get notified the moment our next episode goes live. And believe me, you do not want to miss the incredible lineup of guests that I have in store for you. So, for those who are seeking extra nourishment for your journey, check out the link in the description below. There, you'll find valuable resources, guided meditation, and our vibrant community willing to support you on your path for awakening your best self. Thank you once again for tuning in. Your presence enriches the space so much, and I know that together we can continue to cultivate a mindful and peaceful and authentic life. Until next time, take care and stay true.